Good morning, Blogging Heads Nation. It's Heather Hurlburt from National Security Network.
And it's Eli Lake from the Washington Times and the New Republic, but also from Jamaica.
I was going to say, so what we'll have to wait to find out is whether we're taping this at 9:30 in the morning, whether Eli already has an umbrella drink.
I don't have an umbrella drink. I have a water, but it's very nice here.
Yep, and of course, Eli, what we really want to know is how's the news of troop withdrawals from Afghanistan playing in Jamaica?
I would say that the view here is really didn't notice it. I don't really know that America's at war in 3 Muslim countries. That's my sense. My sense is that there are other more. But Hillary Clinton was actually here in Montego Bay, ironically for like a Caribbean council meeting.
Yeah, I mean, if you remember it, it's less than 2 years ago that the Jamaican state seemed to be on the point of collapse, and they seem, at least I confess it not being a region I cover regularly, to have recovered at least enough to get themselves out of the headlines and to lure back tourists such as yourself. But speaking of the headlines, I actually, I think the big story that's not being discussed all that much is how much more Obama's doing than it was predicted he would do even a week or 10 days ago. The numbers are bigger, but, let's face it, the numbers are it's an artifact of how the media likes to report stories and how we like to talk about horse races. But there's a pretty significant change in strategy, or the beginning of a change in strategy underneath the speech that was made last night.
I couldn't figure out if it was a change in strategy or it was the continuation of what really was a kind of muddled 2 strategies, which is, I think that my sense is the CIA wanted to always do counterterrorism and maintain its relationships with corrupted warlords like Ahmed Wali Karzai and others. And I think that the military, at least under McChrystal and then Petraeus, although Petraeus we know is transitioning to CIA, ironically, wanted to do counterinsurgency, which would be building more credible and legitimate institutions on the local, provincial level. And that those 2 strategies kind of rammed up against each other, especially when it came to not so much the question of how many troops are there, but how many, whether we would continue to have the relationships we've had for many years with these very corrupted warlords that were with us against the Taliban, but weren't very good in terms of building legitimacy as local institutions go.
Eli, I think I hate to get bogged down into a long discussion of counterterrorism versus counterinsurgency, but I think, one of the problems actually with American counterinsurgency theory and the way it's been practiced is that it's not nearly as cut and dried as you described, that it doesn't at all turn out to be the case that in counterinsurgency you don't pay off anybody corrupt and you only work with good guys, that in counterinsurgency, as in counterterrorism, you work with who you can find and you work with who controls territory. And so I think, one of the things, I agree with you that the administration has been trying to do both, and it seems clear that to some extent they'll continue to do both. I asked an administration official this question point blank yesterday, and he said to me, look, we don't have to do counterinsurgency in the whole country. So I think there's an effort to make kind of a targeted combination of the 2. But look, the thing we've learned from the past 2 years, as someone said to me once who'd just gotten back from the region, counterinsurgency is a great theory. It's just very hard to do it with an army of 22 and 25-year-olds. And it assumes a level of sophistication and a degree, of sophisticatedness and comprehensivity in an approach that it just turns out is an optimistic assumption of what, frankly, can be brought to bear and how short-term military funds can be applied to, what are really long-term development problems, frankly, that counterinsurgency presumes to fix. And so, there's this acknowledgement that actually, as beautiful an idea as using the U.S. military to build sustainable local government is, it hasn't worked out all that well. And it's not, again, it's not because anybody's not trying hard. It's not, we have wonderfully dedicated young men and women who have done some great things in some places, but it's not the right tool for the problem.
Well, I guess I would say that, I know for a fact that there was huge disagreements over the question of U.S. support for the warlords that came to the fore in the media, at least. People really talked about it. There were some big New York Times and Washington Post, Washington Times articles about this about a year ago, but it's still, a concern, it's still a tension. And it'll be very interesting now that Mr. Counterinsurgency is now going to take charge of the CIA, because the CIA, of course, was the one key institutional voice for maintaining some of these relationships. I would agree with you to a extent that counterinsurgency demands often that you work with people who have fairly bloody hands. But the difference, I think, is that what counterinsurgency will not allow, or good counterinsurgency doesn't allow, is for you to turn a blind eye to extraordinary corruption or extraordinary abuse of local power, which is what I think, I don't want to call it counterterrorism overall, but at least counterterrorism in Afghanistan as we know it certainly requires you to do to a certain extent. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I predict vis-a-vis Petraeus, whose career, as I've said before, has entailed sort of learning the ins and outs of whatever institution he's attached to. I think he'll become a much more vigorous fan and proponent of counterterrorism strategies and the kind of alliance building that you do in order to be able to have a small footprint on the ground in a place, as opposed to the kind of large footprint alliance building that we've been trying in Afghanistan. Although, I also think we've had the counterinsurgency strategy in Afghanistan was predicated on the idea that you could create a more credible national government and build out and down. And
no, I think it's
I think that has actually, Eli, I know we say that it's the opposite, but in terms of what we've actually done, there's been so much effort put into Karzai. And again, the problem is when you're doing the building from the ground up with units that rotate out every 6 months, which is just the reality of combat. And this is where, the reality of combat and the reality of how you build trusted relationships and help empower local folks to change governance structures are two really different things. You don't do that with a new 25-year-old every 6 months. And this is the problem with counterinsurgency theory, is that it presumes you can do really quickly just by throwing resources at things that, in fact, people who've worked on doing them in a non-military context for 30, 40 years will tell you can take, 10 years to effect.
Well, I certainly think that the military brain trust that put together the counterinsurgency plan for Afghanistan realized it was going to take a long time. I think that the other thing I would just point out about his speech and the plan is that, we had a very revealing 2 sentences that were released by Jeff Morrell by Bob Gates, which said, "I like this plan because there's so much flexibility in it." So I don't know what it necessarily means. I know that the numbers certainly suggest a D-surge, and that's certainly how it was framed. And in that respect, maybe Joe Biden won this internal debate. But in another sense, I think that there's a lot of flexibility for the commanders on the ground. And what your senior officials said, I haven't been in Washington, obviously, sort of rings true with what other people said, is that, it's a very much of a kind of, in certain areas, I think that the military would say the counterinsurgency worked. In certain areas, training of the local police really worked, or they feel confident that certain local gendarmes are going to be much better than others. In other areas, they're just kind of playing, to use an old Iraq war term, whack-a-mole. And in other areas, they haven't really engaged yet. So my sense is that there's still going to be quite a bit of flexibility. And, we'll see if there is a reassessment later on.
I was, I'm going to get really, warning audience, I'm going to get really wonky here. But I was at a wonderful conference on democracy that USAID put together last week. And I was really sad that it attracted a crowd of mostly democracy professionals. And I didn't see anybody I knew from the security universe there, which just reminded me how there's not nearly enough cross-pollination on these things. But an academic from Princeton, whose name I believe is Jeremy Shapiro, but I might be getting that wrong, gave a really interesting talk about looking, not just at Iraq, but also at what had worked in Colombia, and said, basically, the way we have effectively defanged insurgencies at the local level, actually you used some kind of military force, whether it was the U.S. in Iraq, whether it was Colombian government troops after they made some deals got rid of the absolute worst of the paramilitary excesses in Colombia, that basically the military force forms a buffer that allows local leaders who were formerly fighting to build up incentives not to fight. And so, but the outside military force has to form a buffer between the two formerly conflicting sides until they build enough economic or social or whatever relationships that it's no longer in their interest to fight. And he said, that's what happened. That's what happened in Iraq. And if you think about that as a model for Afghanistan, then it's clear that different parts of the country are in very different places with respect to that process. And so then, you need very different strategies in different places. You need not to look at it as a monolith. And frankly, I think people will say to you quietly off the record that they have very different hopes and goals for what can be achieved in different parts of the country.
Well, I mean, there's another interesting thing here. I had an email exchange with somebody who was definitely inside the military, who works on Afghanistan, and is definitely of the view that we should have had less of a de-surge, if you will. And this person said that politically, the reaction after bin Laden's killing was, from Republicans, gave the president, in his view, the political space to kind of oppose the wishes of, Petraeus and Gates as they were shifting or leaving government, or in the case of Petraeus, going to a new job, and that it was because it looked like the Republicans were kind of going back to an anti-interventionist phase that gave a kind of political cover for Obama to side more closely with Biden on this kind of reassessment point.
Another way you can put that, which I think it may be saying more or less the same thing, shockingly enough, is that, everybody, the military, Republicans, the White House, presidential candidates, congressional Democrats, everybody's looking at the same polling data that says, look, the public is done with this. Earlier this week, something came out that for the first time that we were well into the 50s of Americans who said, we need to pull out right away. And everybody is remembering what 2006 looked like and how anger about Iraq drove voters. And right now, Afghanistan isn't that kind of issue for voters. It doesn't have, rightly or wrongly, it just doesn't have the same level of urgency, but it's out there. People are talking about it. People are hearing about it at town halls, and you see. And this is really, it's a nonpartisan thing, because the interesting thing is that sort of everybody's middle voters are in the same place on this. So you see all kinds of calculations being made, both, where's the political advantage or where's the least political disadvantage, but also, just kind of a realistic question from the Pentagon's point of view, what's sustainable? How do we not, again, given the crazy budget games that are going on, how do we not get into something that's not sustainable? And so there, I think, not just bin Laden, but also the kind of crazy budget stalemate we're in, doesn't just give the administration space, but really forces it. The calculus is very different from what it was at the time of West Point. And I think that it's interesting. It's actually it's a nonpartisan phenomena in that it's playing not the same effects, but it's making challenges for both parties.
Well, I guess as somebody who, I kind of have been to Iraq, for 3 extended tours, and I've actually never been to Afghanistan. I'd like to go, but my observation of Afghanistan is that it's just much harder to kind of see where that responsible, non-corrupt government, to see the signs that there's going to be a national government in Kabul that you think is going to be able to do what Obama said in his speech, which is to, police the streets and prevent the Taliban from becoming a safe haven. And so this has this kind of double-edged sword effect. On the one hand, it is an argument for staying, because I can't see the Karzai government and the local governments don't seem like they could they don't seem like they could stop the Taliban, and for that matter, jihadists who could attack us later on from forming a new safe haven. On the other hand, it's an argument for just getting out, because it seems like this is the longest active war we've ever been in as a nation. And if we can't find a decent partner after more than 10 years, then what's the point? So it kind of goes both ways. There's a certain kind of hopelessness to it that showed me the way out, but at the same time, it seems like there's also that's the logic for staying. I don't know how you feel, but that's my macro sense.
I share everybody's frustration with Karzai, and I'm not interested in defending him particularly, but I get a little exhausted with the sort of we can't find a decent partner language, because ultimately it's not our country. And so, there's sort of, can we find a partner for our national interests, which are mostly counterterrorism related? And then the question is, what is it that Afghans want for themselves, and what is it we're interested in partnering with them to do? And there, some of that could better happen at the local level. And if you think about Karzai, who we put in power and we kept in power and we're somewhat responsible for, Karzai has a set of self-interests. And I don't want to suggest that those are good self-interests or moral. I want to be a little careful here, but, there are some questions certainly about people around Karzai and corruption. But at the same time, he acts out of self-interest like everybody else. And instead of this, we can't find a partner, well, what's his self-interest, and how are we going to work with that, not work with that, thwart it, not thwart it? And I understand for domestic political reasons why we have that language, but it's just, imagine looking at the United States and saying, I can't find a partner. Well, obviously, our internal concerns Trump. So, having said that, sorry, just one more point, Eli, because to the question that you actually asked, it's hard. We've reached the point where it does seem as if, in many places, the continued use of American ground forces to pursue our interests in Afghanistan is actually not playing into the self-interests of the people whose self-interest we want to further. And so that's, where I ultimately come down on it being time and then some to start moving out and thinking about other ways of achieving those interests while staying focused on those counterterrorism interests that, frankly, we can only achieve with military forces.
I guess to put a point on it, though, the new model for these conflicts are going to be when you have governments that are weak or too corrupted, and they become safe havens for international terrorist groups that can attack us or other people. The hope is, or at least the idea would be, that you could provide enough training, incentive, and time, and so forth, that you create a government that's capable of doing what we expect governments in the international community to do. And so I'm just pointing out that, do you think that there's a credible argument at this point, Heather, that we're going to find that either in Karzai or the provincial governments? Someone please make that argument for me. Show me how we've improved.
Yeah, well,
show me the glide path.
Be really careful for the idea
that
anything else is ever going to look like Afghanistan.
No, I know that. I'm just pointing out. I'm not asking for democracy, and certainly in the speech, Obama made pretty clear that he wasn't looking for that either. I think what he's looking for is a government that can take care of this safe haven problem once NATO and the United States are gone. Is there any evidence that you can show me in 2 years or 4 years or by 2014 or whenever, pick a date, that that capability is going to exist? And if you can't do that, I would say that does not necessarily augur for one outcome or the other. But it seems like that's kind of where we're at.
Well, so this is where I get in trouble with my friends on the left, because there is zero possibility that in 2012 or 2014 you're going to have an Afghan government that can prevent Afghanistan from being a safe haven all by itself. So, there's not going to be zero U.S. military presence in Afghanistan in 2014. And this is, as I say, I know this is where my progressive friends get frustrated. And I just think you got to be honest about that. And we have some of the responsibility for that because we, the United States, because there are concerns with Karzai that we could have raised earlier, things we could have done differently. But at the same time, again, just to go back to my point about counterinsurgency, the story that we told ourselves in the U.S. from 2002 to 2010 that we had the ability to remake a society, and even though we kept saying, we can't remake this society in our image, no, we actually don't have the ability to remake a society. Only the people in the society have the ability to remake it, and they get to pick. They get to pick what image they want to remake it in. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't build toward a society where various pieces of it are more capable than they were before, and so the U.S. does less and does substantially less. And the point we're at now is that by saying we'll stay indefinitely, you're not encouraging those parts of it that could be doing more to do more. So that's why you have to, and CAP has written a lot about there still not being as much of a plan as there needs to be for how are you going to improve governance, how are you going to fix the things that haven't worked up to now, but that at the same time you have to be on your own track of saying, okay, at a certain point we're gonna stop trying to do this for you because frankly we haven't figured out how to do it in a way that works.
Yeah, listen, I don't think I have a satisfying answer to any of this either. I'm, as you could probably gather, have my doubts about the prospect of a responsible government being able to accomplish what we want in the absence of the U.S. presence. But listen, I also think that for progressives, there's an important kind of moment here. We have a Democratic president, and it's important to sort of ask yourself, so what do you do if you don't think it's realistic or you're not willing to pay the cost in ground troops and treasure? And I don't think that's a question just, by the way, for the progressives. It's a question for all Americans, and the right is asking the same thing. If you're not willing to make the sacrifice to deny safe haven in Afghanistan for al-Qaeda and affiliated groups, which is the goal, then what's your contingency plan? Is that just going to mean you're going to work out a deal to have drone bases in Afghanistan, secret drone bases in Pakistan, I don't know, maybe drones offshore somewhere, and every now and again you're going to fly these missions, you're going to hope that your intelligence is good, you're going to do special forces raids, and you're just going to do that, for the foreseeable future.
So, Eli, I think it's really clear that that's exactly what's going to happen, and I think that's actually a totally non-ideological. It's interesting. I think you get that this question divides both the left and the right.
Yeah.
But it's when confronted with the problem that we're very far away from having an Afghan government that can do this itself, and that we have an imperative, a security imperative that's heightened, as I've said before, by a political imperative that basically we still have this demand that we have, kind of perfect protection from terrorists. That's the pragmatic solution that you come to, I think, wherever you start out on the political spectrum, and it's very clear that that's where we're going. And then I think there's a host of sort of practical and moral questions that grow out of that, but they're not actually political questions in the horse race Democratic versus Republican sense.
Well, I'm less interested in the Democrat versus Republican horse race questions than I am about, but then don't you think that you run the risk of, over time, that's not going to be good enough? And at least there's a very good chance, it seems like, you could find yourself in a scenario where it's 2022, and after a truly catastrophic event, there is a political demand that you have to go back into Afghanistan, and this time you have to do what Petraeus wanted to do in 2009 and 2010, and that is counterinsurgency. Build the institutions so that one day, although it's going to take longer than we'd like, the Afghanistan local, provincial, and federal government can make sure that its territory does not become a safe haven in the future. And that's a long-term project. And I think that's the argument that's made by the counterinsurgency side of the debate within the Obama administration right now.
So let me
is that we either do it now or we do it later.
Let me put this as bluntly as I can. We cannot build those institutions with the U.S. military. It is not possible. It is faintly possible that over 10 or 20 years, the international community could work with Afghans to build an Afghan government that can do more of this stuff. It cannot be done. The long-term problems that you're talking about cannot be solved by applying the U.S. military model of CERP funding and counterinsurgency. If you look at places that have gone from having totally failed, collapsed states to fairly functional states, and there are some, Central America is an interesting example, although again, they started from...
Colombia is a good example.
Colombia is another good example. Some places in Africa are a good example. If you look at how that spooled out, even the security sector reform was civilian-led. It was done over 10 years, and it wasn't done with an occupying force. And so if what you're arguing, and the terrible irony, by the way, of the American political system is that exactly the kind of long-term real partnership to help Afghans remake their society, or Pakistanis, by the way, the real partnership with Pakistani civilian authorities to remake their societies, we have zero chance of getting the money for that through Congress, because the only way you can get significant amounts of money for new assistance programs like that is if it's associated with the U.S. military. So the terrible irony for somebody like me, who really does believe the U.S. has an obligation to help Afghans build a better society for themselves, is that the vehicle to get know-how and money and resources into that society is the U.S. military, but it's the wrong vehicle if you want to actually if you want the people on the ground in the society to get results and own those results. So that's the terrible conundrum that we're in.
I think that the military did a pretty good job of counterinsurgency and at least building up the national military in Iraq. They're certainly not the national police. And I think that if you're going back to Colombia, I know a little bit about that example. There was a fairly extensive military campaign against the FARC. And you're right, it did take civilian leadership in Colombia and ultimately a kind of transition. But at a certain point, counterinsurgency needs to have both. It's not one or the other. And I think that, this is the direction, at least, of where Petraeus wanted to take the military, though it's interesting if it's going to continue to go in that direction. And I'm not calling for an indefinite occupation. I'm just saying that I think the military needs to have the withdrawal dates, or what they would say is they want to set their withdrawal dates based on outcomes, based on the capacity of the Afghan government and other sorts of things, not based on just sort of deadlines like by the end of 2012 we're going to have this many people out and so forth.
Well, in fact, Gates, one of the things that Gates said when he was asked about the president's plan that was announced last night was, I really like this because it has so much flexibility in it.
Yeah, that's what I said earlier.
In fact, there is an extraordinary amount of flexibility for the commanders. But, one of the other things, is that the president has to weigh not just what the generals say about the situation on the ground, but also, sort of what are the competing demands on U.S. resources? What are the competing U.S. interests? What is the readiness of society to stay the course? And if you can't, Eli, there really is a lot of expertise that actually says you can't build civilian institutions with a military force. So if you're hearing from your experts that actually the long-term challenges you have are not going to be met with the military, if you're hearing a message very clearly from society that they're not willing to pay for another 10 years to find out, then the responsible course is to try to start yourself on a drawdown trajectory in a way that's not precipitous, but that also, doesn't pretend that you're going to be able to do things that, in fact, if you look at the domestic situation, A, you can't do, and B, don't work anyway. So this idea that sort of only the generals' voices should have been listened to, I think, is a real misunderstanding of what presidential leadership is supposed to be.
I'm not necessarily saying only. I was trying to just give what their argument was. I think what their arguments were. I don't know. I don't profess to have to know one way or the other what the right call is. I think it's extremely uncertain. I don't see any evidence that that at the end of this process there's going to be a responsible government in Kabul or in the provinces that are going to be able to deny a safe haven. So, as I said earlier, I think in the dialogue, that could augur for a kind of despair which says, let's just cut our losses, or it could argue for a doubling down that says we can't afford to lose and therefore we have to persevere, and smart people make both of those arguments. It's one of these things where I'm much more of a reporter on that. I sort of look at it as, those are the contours of the debate. Presidential leadership is, yes, you have to listen to everybody and everyone's advice and how much it's costing, whether you think you can afford it, and so forth. But I thought, just to going back to presidential leadership, there was a little bit of everything for everyone in Obama's speech, which is why it's so telling that Gates said there was so much flexibility in it. Because on the one hand, if you wanted to hear Obama say that we were going to be there for a very long time, he did not say when all the troops would be coming home. He said that there would be a regular drawdown after a certain point, but didn't specify what that would mean. He also said that there would be a long-term partnership and engagement with the Afghan government. So those would augur for the long-term building institutions approach. But then he also made it clear that the surge troops that he announced at the West Point speech would be coming home, and there were other things that he sort of said for the other side of that. So I think he's still keeping his options open very much.
Well, but Eli, that's perfectly consistent if you don't have the idea that the U.S. military is the only vehicle to do these things with. And again, there are just, the military is very good at training militaries. It's very good at killing. It's very good at denying territory. It's very good at chasing down terrorists. It's not really so good at building judicial systems. That's not what it was designed to do. That's not what people are trained to do. So again, you have a whole range of tools and a whole when you say long-term engagement with, and you say long-term engagement with the Afghan government, but I actually think in some ways it's more important to think about it as long-term engagement with Afghan society. And one of the things, frankly, that the administration has struggled with a bit is giving the message that we're not just about propping up Karzai, that we're about, and this is something that we did eventually manage to do in Iraq, that we're about engaging with different sectors of society and helping them figure out how they're going to be in balance with each other. And, again, that's not necessarily something that you want to have your highly trained, best in the world killing force in the lead for.
Well, fine. I would just point out that you should look at the Special Inspector General for the Iraq, known as the SIGAR. Their reports on, the State Department's initial police training program, I don't know if there's any good U.S. institutions that are doing this.
There are internationals who do police training much better than the U.S. does. No argument from me there. Because we don't.
I don't know if I would trust the international community either.
Because we don't have a national police force actually. So we tend to have trouble drawing. And this has been true for since the end of the Cold War when we started trying to do this. But it's very hard for us to recruit and deploy the kinds of people you'd want for the training. In part just because we don't have a centralized national police force. It's one of the, great things about our small G government society, but it fits us ill. So, but that doesn't make or break the point.
Well, all right. Well, if you want to say that the military shouldn't be doing a whole bunch of things, I'm just saying I've seen the military do pretty impressive work on a whole of government approach in Iraq. And that seems to be something that's been confirmed by outside auditors and so forth. And I've also seen the military screw things up, so it's not a perfect thing. I would just end with this point here. Afghanistan, Somalia, increasingly Yemen, these are responsibilities that affect the entire world. These are places where, because of instability, radical groups can set up safe havens and then launch attacks against lots of people. Not just the United States, but international shipping. It's bad for everyone. The UN seems incapable of doing anything about that, and the UN really can't be expected to do it because it doesn't really have its own military, and its at least lift capability or transportation capability is pretty much the U.S. government as well. And increasingly, it seems like the U.S., because of lots of financial reasons and politically, is kind of wary of these kinds of interventions. But eventually, someone has to do it. And I find an overlooked story of 2011, but might be a harbinger of things to come, is that in Somalia, the United Arab Emirates is basically paying a bunch of military contractors, including Saracen and people who used to be part of Executive Outcomes, to train an anti-piracy force in Puntland, Somalia, and to do the kind of thing that we used to think that U.S. Special Forces would do, or the U.S. military would do. And I guess my question to you is this the future, and are you comfortable with military contractors funded by wealthy Gulf Arab, Emirates, filling and doing the sort of thing that the United States used to do? Because someone at a certain point has to go into Yemen and take out the bad guys and try to build some capacity there so the bad guys don't come back.
Well, Eli, that's a great question, and there are two answers to it. First of all, you may know, and Libya may have changed this, but prior to Libya, there was all the U.S. military training that was being done in Africa, all the U.S. military advising that was being done in Africa was done by contractors. And why is that, you might ask? Because all the U.S. troops were committed to Iraq or Afghanistan. So that, first of all, is a fabulous argument for getting out of Iraq and Afghanistan and then having the resources and then having, I think, the larger debate about what is an appropriate role for the U.S. in those conflicts, what's an appropriate role for other countries, and where should we be committing our own troops versus where might it be better to be using contractors. So that's sort of point number one. And point number two is, again, Afghanistan got as bad as it got. The Taliban, controlled the government and invited al-Qaeda in because of, more than a decade of mistakes and tragedies, the Soviet invasion, the response of the U.S., the precipitous removal of the U.S. So again, a lot of things that were not only or not primarily military. In Yemen right now, you have on the one hand the drone war, the CIA base, all of that. On the other hand, you have these fascinating developments. What kind of government is Yemen going to have? Who's going to be in it? Who's going to be out of it? How are they going to approach the outside world? Who are they going to see as their friends and people they're willing to listen to? And what the U.S. diplomatic position on that has been somewhat unclear. Is the U.S. completely lined up with the Saudis? Are we taking a more complex view? What's our role? And that is at least as important as the drone war in the long term, sort of what kind of place is Yemen and how hospitable is it to people who are threatening to our interests and the security of our citizens. So again, looking at this through a uniquely military lens actually gets you in at least as much, it gets you in at least as much trouble as it gets you out of trouble by killing individual terrorist leaders. So that's the thought I would leave with, and make sure you go have one more umbrella drink, Eli, before you come back to the content.
Yeah, well, just in quick kind of response to that, I only ask it as a question of the U.S. role in the world. I mean, this used to be something that we just assumed the United States would be the biggest donor, in the donor conferences too, when there were these kind of failed state scenarios, and that there would be elements of the U.S. that would help. Kind of be the biggest, the biggest contributor at least to the stability in these kinds of scenarios. And increasingly, I find the Somalia case so interesting because it's not just that it's contractors who are doing the training, but it's the what's so interesting is that it's the UAE that's paying for it. And if that's the new world, that's interesting. It's kind of it's very much of a post-American, or it's the beginning of a post-American world.
Well,
I don't know what I think of it.
It's a post-unilateral, it's a post-unipolar world, I think, is what I would say about it, Eli. And maybe we'll save that for discussion another time.
All right.
Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.